Hello and welcome to CS Week Marketplace. This series offers fresh perspectives and strategies presented by knowledge specialists with the Conference 40 Platinum and Gold sponsors. I'm Lisa Collins with CS Week, and I'll be your moderator today, along with Jennifer Gilmer with Neustar, who will facilitate your question and answer session. We invite you to mark your calendars for CS Week and Conference 41 to be held May 22nd to the 26th, 2017 at the Fort Worth Convention Center in Fort Worth, Texas. Watch your email and our social media channels for registration information later this fall. This program will be recorded and available for playback along with our other archive presentations later this afternoon. You will find it by selecting Marketplace under the Webinars drop-down menu on the CS Week homepage. Attendees are encouraged to upload questions to the Q&A panel as they arise. However, they will be held for the Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. Please ensure that you address your questions to all panelists so that all questions are captured and presented. Today's webinar is TCPA, What Utilities Need to Know About Mitigating Risk in Outbound Customer Communications with Neustar. Our presenters today are Becky Burr and Chris Clark. Becky Burr serves as Chief Privacy Officer and Deputy General Counsel at Neustar. As the Chief Privacy Officer, Ms. Burr is responsible for ensuring that the company maintains state-of-the-art privacy practices that always protect customer and consumer information. She was previously a partner at Wilmer Hale and is also a veteran of the Federal Trade Commission and the Commerce Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Chris Clark has served as Neustar's Director of Fraud, Risk, and Compliance since 2011. For the last 4 years, Chris has managed large-scale TCPA risk mitigation solutions to the collections and financial services industry. In his current role, Chris and his team are responsible for evaluating, developing, and implementing TCPA and customer communication improvement strategies in the electric, gas, and water utility industries. Welcome, Becky and Chris, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I guess good morning for a few folks, depending upon where you are in the country. And thanks to the CS Week folks who helped kind of put this all together. Certainly appreciate your partnership. So today we're talking about the TCPA, most people's favorite topic to typically discuss. Becky's going to go into kind of some of the background of the TCPA, where it is today, historical background. She's going to talk about some of the FCC declaratory rulings that happened back in 2015. We're going to talk about utilities and how the TCPA specifically applies to utilities directly. We're going to talk about how Neustar is helping utilities and various other companies and other industries manage TCPA risk, specifically around reassigned phone numbers. And we have an interesting risk assessment analysis that we put together for another utility. We're actually using some of their customer phone data, and it provides an interesting snapshot of the level of phone reassignment within their phone population. And it's usually a very interesting slide for a lot of folks to see, specifically within the utility industry. So TCPA compliance, why should you care? So any company that is conducting automated outbound phone calls or text messages should care, because it applies to you. And there are, and tend to be, some pretty significant repercussions associated with companies that do not fully comply along the lines of class action lawsuits, significant fines, hits to companies' brand image. So there's a lot of very negative consequences associated with it. And plus, unwanted calls and text messages are the #1 complaint to the FCC by consumers. I'm unaware of one single person that likes receiving random text messages or phone calls where nobody picks up. Everybody knows that sound of a phone call from an auto dialer. They answer it, they just hear blank air. I'm unaware if anybody likes that, so that makes it even more of a prominent issue. And plus, with the declaratory rulings back in 2015, corporate America was offered no relief. It was very much a pro-consumer ruling, which means you should probably care about it a little bit more than that. Plus, there's a lot of very opportunistic consumers and attorneys out there that are doing their best to skirt around the rules and make the TCPA into a benefit for them. So combination of those types of consumers and attorneys out there with companies that are trying to do the right thing, but thus they have bad phone data, as an example. This webinar should be a good use of time for you guys. So TCPA lawsuits are on the rise, and from my perspective, this is good and bad for utilities. The good news for utilities is they have not historically been targeted. There have not been a lot of high-profile class action lawsuits. That's typically been reserved for industries that have a much bigger, wider target on their back, such as the collection industry or financial services. There's been a lot of high-profile class action lawsuits and cases associated with that. So the good news is that utilities have a lot to learn from the financial services industry and the collection industry as far as what they're doing to mitigate some of these risks. And Neustar's got a lot of history working with a lot of large banks along those lines. So again, great stuff to learn there. I guess the bad side of that is that the banks and the collection agencies have gotten very good at mitigating some of these risks. So naturally, some of these opportunistic consumers and attorneys run into dead ends with the banks and the collection agencies, they start shifting over into other industries. Okay, so Becky, the TCPA has been around since actually 1991. Maybe you can give us some background on the TCPA, why it was initially put into place, how it's changed over the years, where it is today, and maybe where you think it's going into the future.
Sure. 1991 was a long time ago in terms of technology, communications technology. And Congress was very concerned about the increased deployment of auto-dialing equipment, of sophisticated auto-dialing equipment that could dial random or sequential numbers, so you didn't even actually have to have a list of numbers that you wanted called, but it could randomly dial those or just do it sequentially. And mobile telephony was in its infancy then, but to the extent that it was available, it was a called party pays arrangement, which meant if somebody called you on your mobile phone, then you paid for that call. So in order to address the fact that that calling the cost of calling could be increasingly shifted to wireless consumers, and to worry about the notion that you might use an auto dialer to tie up every number in a hospital, for example, or another emergency facility in sequence. Congress passed TCPA to protect public safety concerns. That's the tying up emergency communications, and to protect consumers in a cost-shifting arrangement. The rules are developed and enforced by the Federal Communications Commission, and that distinguishes this from the telephone sales rule, for example, which involves the do not call list, which is administered and enforced by the FTC. But I think it's important for everybody to understand that what we were dealing with was a 1991 called party pays arrangement, and that's an arrangement that has changed over time. But the FCC has the authority and has used its authority to implement the rules in a manner that addresses changing consumer concerns.
Okay, great. So the declaratory ruling. So from my perspective, and talking to a lot of companies within the financial services industry and utilities too, there was a big shift right after the declaratory rulings, and a lot of things were clarified. And truth be told, it scared a lot of companies. They didn't really understand it, know what to do, but there were definitely some key points that came out of it. So talk about a couple of these key points that are especially important to utilities and what they should be thinking about.
Sure. So going into the 2015 declaratory ruling, a couple of things were going on. As you mentioned, there was a dramatic and sustained increase in class action litigation involving TCPA violations. And a lot of marketers and other entities, companies that communicate with consumers for a variety of reasons, were really seeking some clarification on some of the most contentious points, some of the things where it seems like the courts were really applying a very aggressive interpretation of TCPA. So the other thing that happened, of course, was that in 2013, the FCC changed the rules about what kind of consent you had to have for marketing calls, and they changed it in a way that required prior written consent consistent with the way the FTC approaches that. So there was a lot of concern going in about increased exposure and increasing requirements. And so people asked for some clarifications and some assurances on a couple of key points. One very important aspect was the definition of a called party. This really arises in a context where a caller has received valid consent from the holder of a telephone, of a wireless number, and they have the requisite consent, but then unbeknownst to them, the subscriber, the consumer, turns in their telephone number and gets a new one, and that number is reassigned. So callers said, I have consent from, based on a really good faith belief about what the subscriber of this telephone number is. Now, all of a sudden, I am in violation because unbeknownst to me, the number has changed and I've called somebody else. In this declaratory ruling, the FCC said, sorry, your intentions do not really matter here. TCPA requires the consent of the current subscriber or the current user, the consistent user. And the TCPA, recognizing that auto-dialing a reassigned phone number would pose risks, and we'll talk about how they propose to address it. But definitely your intentions here don't matter. What matter is the subscriber or current user of the telephone. The FCC also clarified, and I think this has some significant implications, that the consumer must be able to revoke their consent freely and readily. You know, prior express consent is required to auto-dial, and that means, under the FCC's interpretation, that the consumer must be free to revoke that consent at any time through any reasonable means and wherever you interact with consumers. So if you have retail locations, you need to be able to accept revocations there. If you have, you know, customer support lines, the same is true. One of the things that people really had hoped for help from the FCC was on the definition of an auto dialer. The FCC rules have said basically anything that has the capacity to dial random or sequential numbers is an auto dialer, no matter how the equipment is actually being used. So many people were trying to understand what they would need to do to their equipment to render it, you know, not an auto dialer. Here, the FCC not only declined to provide a sort of easy to apply test to what is an auto dialer and what is not an auto dialer. But they really said the function of an auto dialer is to dial a lot of numbers fast and without human intervention. And any equipment that has the capacity to store, produce, and dial random numbers is an auto dialer, even if it's not presently used for that purpose, and even if you actually have to engage to modify the equipment to allow it to perform that function. So even if you have to add software or modify the software, if it's a sort of foreseeable, reasonably foreseeable modification, that's covered. And they said, you know, we can tell you that, you know, at one end of the spectrum, we don't think rotary dial telephones are auto dialers, even though theoretically they could be modified to do that. And they also said, you know, we also don't think, you know, speed dials on smartphones are auto dialers, but that's largely because consumers are not complaining about that at this point. And finally, they did provide some limited exemptions for time-sensitive financial or health calls, and clarified the you know, the existence of emergency calls.
Great, thanks. So reassigned phone numbers. I know you talked about this briefly in the previous slide, and I think, you know, what we typically hear from utilities is, you know, there's a consent component initially, which we're going to get into that in a second. But reassigned phone numbers is a huge concern from our perspective. You know, utilities have that consent when somebody provides that phone number at the time of application that originates service. But then it's just managing for reassigned phone numbers. And because you've gone to this, you know, already, I won't make you go through all of this, but do you see anything changing along the lines of reassigned phones? Do you see the FCC saying, hey, you know, what's in place now is going to change in the future, or should companies be concerned with reassigned phones as they are now moving forward into the future?
Well, I think, you know, numbering resources are finite, and phone numbers are reassigned quite quickly, increasingly quickly these days. So, and the FCC has made it quite clear that, the called party is the subscriber or customary user of that call, and nothing is going to change to give it any real relief there. Now, the FCC has provided a one-call exception, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So I'll defer. Just to quickly go over the one-call exception, the FCC said essentially we will give you one free call to a reassigned number, but after you make that call, even if the person has not answered the phone, even if you have essentially no notice that the number has been reassigned, you will be deemed to have effective notice that the number's been assigned, and therefore you will be liable for violations. The FCC admitted in a very straightforward way that this was not a solution based on sort of when a caller could actually be expected to have actual knowledge, because you never know if you've made the first call or not until it's too late. But they said basically we're just kind of balancing the hardship to callers and concern for customer, for consumer privacy, and we're making a call there. Now, they also pointed to things that callers could do. They could try to require customers to notify them when they change their telephone numbers, although even if the consumers don't provide any notice, the callers are still liable. You can register triple tones, which suggest disconnects. You can use third-party data providers to help you identify reassigned phone numbers. They acknowledge that there's no silver bullet, but they basically said, on balance, we're calling it for consumers on this one. Callers have some options available that will help them minimize exposure, but on balance, the liability is going to remain with the callers.
Great, thanks. So utilities and TCPA, so this is where we get into some of the content that's much more specific to utilities. And as I mentioned previously, consent's always a topic that's brought up often by utilities. And what consent do we have if somebody provides us a cell phone number at the time of application or when they originate power service or water service or whatever it may be? Is that consent for us to communicate with that consumer on their cell phone, assuming it has not been reassigned? So there's really two buckets here of consent, prior express consent and written consent. So Becky, kind of walk us through the differences between these two types of consent and what applies to what type of calls, and specifically utilities where, the vast majority of their calls are lots of informational purpose, outage notifications, billing reminders, shut-off reminders, plus some probably marketing calls that would require more of a written consent, and some collections calls as well. So kind of walk us through the differences between these two types of consent and what applies to the various types of calls that utilities are making.
Sure. So as I mentioned, the FCC changed the rules about consent in 2013. The FCC had typically basically said if a consumer provides a telephone number, a wireless number to you in a context in which they understand you'll be using that number to communicate, then you can infer their consent to receive communications from you at that number. And prior to 2013, that applied to all calls. But after the FCC changed the rules with respect to any kind of telemarketing call, and that is any call that includes any marketing message whatsoever, even if it's coupled with an informational message or something else. What they said is, in that context, you need prior express written consent, and that doesn't mean necessarily a wet ink signature on a piece of paper, but it means a kind of documented consent that meets the requirements under the e-Sign Act. So if consent is captured over the telephone, you have to record that, or you can have some kind of, check boxes where you're clearly checking opt-in to receive telemarketing calls at that number. So you can continue to provide sort of non-marketing calls so long as you have informed consumers that that's what you're going to be doing with it. But with respect to any kind of marketing call, you really need a very specific written consent. And that consent cannot be made a condition of purchase.
Great. So this slide is interesting. Unfortunately, we can't do a live Q&A right now, but typically when we've given this presentation in the past or a similar version of it, this slide we always get stuck on for a while. There's a lot of questions. And, the various types of communications that utilities are making, nobody really knows what is potentially exempt under the TCPA, what's not, what they should be concerned about, so on and so forth. So I actually saw a question come through here in the WebEx Q&A, and I think that we might answer this question here. But a question we get asked often is, shut off service for non-payment. I suppose who you ask, you get a completely different answer. If you ask an attorney that's has a client that got caught in a TCPA situation, they might answer it one way. But the utility, if they're shutting power off, that's potentially an emergency situation that the TCPA doesn't apply. So utilities are making all sorts of outbound communications. So kind of walk us through here. What should utilities be concerned with when it comes to the various types of outbound communications?
So the first thing I would say is, the best way to protect yourself is to make pretty clear disclosures here. But any kind of disaster or outage notification, there's a power, shutdown or a power outage in this location or another, that is most likely simply exempt under TCPA. Likewise, a rolling outage notification is likely exempt as an emergency notification. A true shutoff for non-payment of a utility, your electricity is going to be shut off, your water is going to be shut off, those kinds of things. We're not providing legal advice, but I think most folks would consider that exempt under the emergency provisions. So long as you actually are, about to shut off a utility, as opposed to, a threatened shut off, a collections call masquerading as a shutoff. So you need to have real clear written policies that would enable you to demonstrate that the consumer was in imminent risk of having their utility service disrupted. Again, under those circumstances, any kind of outage or a shutoff for non-payment, where that's a true shutoff notice, is most likely going to be considered exempt. For general notifications, where you have provided enough information in the context, meter reading schedules, billing notifications, rates, eligibility, usage, or conservation messaging, informational or account-related notifications. TCPA does require prior express consent. However, that condition will be satisfied if the customer has provided the phone number at the time of enrollment, and there's information that they would expect, that would put them on notice that they can expect to be communicated in that way. Any telemarketing message for new services, for additional services, anything of the like, even if it's coupled with an informational message, that will require prior express written consent, and the consents the content of the consent notice is pretty precise. Consumers need to be on notice that you are going to be calling them using auto dialer or automated dialing equipment, and that their agreement is not a condition of purchase. There was one question, if I could just, there's one question that I wanted to make sure that we got to in here about downloading calls for debt recovery calls, and the questioner asked and went on to say, these are not random or sequential, they're specific phone numbers. Does that make any difference? And the answer is, if your equipment, obviously, calling for debt recovery, you're not likely dialing random or sequential numbers. But if your equipment, the equipment you are using to auto dial those calls, can be used for sequential or random dialing, even if it would require some modification, then you are covered. So it's not whether the call is the dialing is actually random or sequential. It has more to do with the capacity of your telephone system than the actual calls that are being made.
Great. Thanks very much, Becky. So who is Neustar? This is where we're going to get into kind of Neustar's background and what we're specifically doing with utilities and how we've been helping banks over the past 4 or 5 years with TCPA risk mitigation. And so Neustar's background, really a lot of people interact with us on a daily basis, but they just don't know us by name. So Neustar powers 85% of all the caller ID in the United States. So whenever you see a name appended to a handset, most likely that's Neustar. We're putting the name on that handset. We also deliver and manage all of the directory assistance on behalf of the phone carriers in the United States. We deliver all the daily ported phone numbers and all the ported phone data. So when a phone ports between Verizon Wireless or AT&T, we're that kind of neutral third party in the background that's making sure that that transaction happens quickly. We also provide a lot of market share analytics to all the phone companies and help them kind of better understand their marketplaces. So as you can see, people probably touch us at least once a day for various reasons. And that's kind of the backbone of Neustar, and specifically as it relates to TCPA. And it's a lot of very phone-centric, authoritative data that we're working with. And, we have access to all of this phone carrier data. It's heavily restricted what we can and can't use it for. But one of the things we use it for, which helps in TCPA risk mitigation situations, is verifying information. And you think about what caller ID does. Caller ID just matches a name to a phone number, and that's basically what a TCPA verification is, specifically around reassigned phone numbers. It's just ensuring and verifying that the phone number you are about to text message or auto dial today is still owned by that person that provided consent initially, whether that was in the past month or with utilities, which is can be a big issue. You know, utilities have clients that have been around for 40 years. Whether or not the same phone number that a utility has on record is the one that they provided initially 40 years ago, probably not, but it's very different than a lot of other industries, such as the auto lenders, for example. They have, the longest loans they have is typically 5 years, so that's typically what they would have on record is a phone number that's about 5 years old. With utilities, it can be much more heavily aged, since it therefore can be much more of a heavy risk. And I'll actually get into that here in a second. So again, this is just a quick snapshot. You know, we've been, you know, helping most of the top 10 banks out there identify reassigned phone numbers, certainly with working with a lot of retailers. We've been doing a lot of work in collections over the past 4 or 5 years. But again, you know, what I mentioned previously, utilities are in a good spot. There's a lot to learn from these companies, the mistakes they've made, what they've put into place that have worked. So there's a lot of learning that can be done. So this is actually beginning of an actual reassigned phone risk assessment, and it's something that we are currently offering to utilities. If you would like to have us perform this same risk assessment with using some of your customer phone numbers, happy to put that in place, and we'd actually provide almost these exact same slides back to you. And it just gives you kind of a high-level snapshot of how good and accurate your phone data is, and you know what the potential risks are for reassigned phones. And it breaks it down by percentages, and it's usually a very interesting and eye-opening process for a utility because, you know, again, as I mentioned previously, utilities can have that very aged phone data, and therefore over time people change phone numbers all the time, and there tends to be a much higher percentage of bad phone data within a utility's repository, and that creates risks, obviously TCPA related, but there's also a lot of other negative impacts associated with bad phone information. I've actually got a slide here towards the end, which will kind of go into some of those benefits of having good, accurate phone data that's not TCPA related. So the solution that Neustar has is called actually verification for TCPA. And the minimal inputs that we would need for it is just a first name, last name, and a phone number. And then we can just tell you the relationship between those two pieces of information. You know, does this person own the phone number, yes or no? We can accept an address. An address is very helpful with identifying family plans. So if the carriers have on record, a lot of times they do, it's just that one person that originated the phone service, and they don't know who owns the other 4 phones or who's in physical possession of the other 4 phones on that family plan. So if we have an address, and because we get this data sourced to us directly from the phone carriers, and they provide information such as address and email along with name and phone number, you know, we can link that actual phone number to the address, which says, hey, you know, we've ultimately got a different name linked to that phone number because it's most likely a family plan, and because we see that that phone links to the address, it's even much more of a family plan and probably a good phone number. So it just provides an additional layer of granularity. You know, with we can input an email, same thing. We can link a phone number to an email, which kind of helps identify some of those family plans. And we can even you can even submit a date. So typically that's the date that you last saw consent or received consent on that phone number. You spoke to that person over the phone. They called from the call center. Or it might be the date that they initially set up service and provided that phone number. And we can tell you if there's been any changes, reassignment since that specific date. And so the outputs are, you know, just a verification. Does this person own the phone number? Yes or no? Is the phone type wireless? Is it landline? Or is it potentially a voice over IP phone, an over-the-top voice over IP phone, which tends to carry some risk? We've got some phone activity codes, which I won't go into too much, but phone activity is a service that was built using all of our caller ID traffic, where we see about 4 billion phone numbers hit our caller ID network every day. And easy way to explain it, it's very predictive in how likely somebody is to answer the phone. So the more outbound calls we see on a phone, the more likely somebody is to actually answer the phone. So if you're trying to reach a customer for a collections call, for example, and you've got a couple of different phone numbers, you're trying to pick which ones they're most likely to answer, that service comes in very handy, and it's very popular with a lot of the collection agencies, because collection agencies are not auto-dialing cell phones quite as often just because of the risks. So there's a lot of manual dialing going on, and obviously a lot more costly dial, so they use that to improve dialing efficiencies. So this is the data, just a high-level snapshot of the data we receive from this utility. And again, they submitted a name, a phone number, and an address. And 70% of their phone numbers, and this was a true random sample, 70% of their phone numbers were wireless phone numbers that they have on record, and about 30% were landline. And this is typical with what we see within utilities. In other industries, it's lower, but for whatever reason in utilities, we've seen this about 70% pretty consistently. So if you think that 70% of your phone numbers are wireless, that means there's a lot of potential risk there. And these are the actual results from this utility. This is the breakdown, the distribution of the verification category. So the greens means we definitively have that name linked to the phone number. And on the two bar charts there, the one on the far right is landline. The one to the left of it is the wireless phone. So we broke it apart by landline and wireless. So we would say that, looking at the wireless bar there, the 61% plus the code 6s, which is that kind of bluish teal color, is where we have the phone linked to the address. All of those are good to dial. The category 5s, where we have no data available, it could be a phone number where we just don't have any phone number, any name linked to that phone number. It could be a phone number that somebody has abandoned, they've given up to the carrier, and it truly doesn't have an owner at that time, or for a variety of reasons the carrier is just not publishing the name associated with that phone number to us. Then the group 3s there, the orange, that's where we have basically a negatively verified phone to what you submitted to us, but we see that phone's linked to a business. So for example, Neustar provides employees business phones, or phones for primarily business use, but most people use it for personal use as well. And that person might be in physical possession of it, but the carrier typically does not know the individual consumer that's in physical possession of that phone. So we would say, hey, that Neustar owns that phone, yet they obviously, somebody submitted it at some point. So it's a business phone, but most likely it might be a consumer that's in physical possession of it, just utilizing a phone that was provided to them for their business or from their business. So less risk associated with that. And then this is about 20% of phones linking to a different consumer in utilities. It's pretty common, and this is definitely higher than other industries from what we typically see. Because again, it could have been a phone number that was provided a long time ago, and the likelihood that that person still owns that phone number as time goes by and progresses increases day by day. So it's typically a number that we see with utilities, which to us is a pretty high risk. So this is the slide I mentioned previously about other impacts to utilities. And even going back to that other slide, that 20%. So what we're hearing more and more often every day from utilities is that, yeah, TCPA is a challenge for us. We're certainly concerned about it. But our business is predicated based upon customer service. We want to improve the customer experience. We want to ensure that the phone calls that our customers want to receive, various outage notifications, billing reminders, that they continue to receive them. The problem is that when a consumer changes their phone number, the first thing they do not think to do is run back to their utility and update their phone information. But if we can step in and proactively help you, alert you as to a customer that had changed their phone number, and you can proactively reach out to them and get updated phone information from them. so that they can continue to receive those calls, that there's excellent value in that. And you know, the value, if 20% of the phone numbers link to a different consumer and they're not getting to your customers, and you know, there's obviously value for sending these outage notifications, for reminding them of emergencies, that there's a power outage or there's some storm that's approaching, they should be aware. You know, there's value in that. But the problem is if the phone numbers are wrong, those calls are worthless. And this is what we're hearing more and more from utilities, because utilities, less so with banks or collection agencies, they're much more customer and consumer centric and centrically focused. So they want to do the right thing. They want to make sure that it's a good experience for their customers. You know, plus there's a lot of business cases, a lot of potential ROIs associated with this. You know, certainly the customer aspect of it is number one, but then you start looking at, hey, you know, if we're sending these messages as a pre-alert that their service is going to be disconnected, you know, we don't want to go through that process. It's a negative experience for the customer. If they would receive that text message that says, hey, we're going to shut off your power in 48 hours unless you pay your bill, most likely people see that and they quickly pay their bill. But if it's a wrong phone number and you ultimately have to disconnect their service, you know, there's a cost to a utility for doing that in many different forms, and plus, you know, the negative experience for the customer. And the utility might be saying, hey, we're sending you these messages, but they're just not getting anywhere and they're not reaching that end person. So there's a lot of value associated with that. You know, what other things we've been hearing is, you know, if you can help us manage our customer phone information before we send this off to a collection agency where we know we're providing good quality phone numbers, that there's value for that. We can potentially reduce our costs that we're paying the collection agency we work with. And plus, you know, shared TCPA risk between a utility and a collection agency. There's a lot of debate as far as, you know, who's ultimately at risk. I think from our perspective, and you know, what we would say, there's a shared risk there. And if you can help a collection agency mitigate some of that risk up front before those phone numbers go to the collection agency, that there's certainly value there from both of you guys. And again, you know, this last bullet down here, you know, protecting and enhancing brand image. You know, people don't like getting random phone calls that have nothing to do with them, and it's just a nuisance. And I think utilities, out of all of the industries that we work in, you know, again, they want to do the right thing. They want to be very customer focused, and they want to protect their brand image. But you know, sending text messages and automated phone calls to wrong numbers, you know, isn't that much of a customer-centric activity. So here's a couple of examples of delivery options, and I'll kind of go through these kind of quickly because I want to get to some Q&A that we have. So batch files, I think most people send us, certainly in collections, you know, batch files of customer names and phone numbers, and we can verify phone numbers on a daily basis. You can send us as many files as you like. We've also recently built a proactive change notification platform, which is very popular with utilities. And this is where we would ultimately host your customer data, and then as soon as we see a change to a phone number, the day of we see a change in ownership, we'll alert you so that you can proactively reach out to your customers and say, hey, we think you might have changed your phone number or something along those lines. You know, would you be interested in updating your phone information? And that gives you a window of time in between when the phone service is changed until when you'd actually be communicating with that person. So if that person goes into a debt collection scenario, if you can get out in front of that and proactively get updated phone information before that person goes into collections, you've already got the updated phone information taken care of, versus having to wait to when they go into collections and then trying to realize that you have bad phone information. It's too late at that point. So the proactive change notification platform has been very popular with utilities. So key takeaways, you know, TCPA and utilities, you should absolutely care. Utilities are certainly placing a lot of outbound customer communications over phone, and it certainly applies. managing consent, getting that consent. If somebody provides that phone number to you at the time of application, from our perspective, that's the express consent. That's what you need to communicate with them, with your consumers for everything basically besides marketing calls. And then managing the consent moving forward, and then also managing for reassigned phones. If you can do those two things, where you have the consent, you can manage the consent, and you can manage for reassigned phone numbers, you're really all set. That's really what you need to be looking at and doing. And again, happy to provide a free reassigned phone risk assessment, just like we ran through a few slides ago. That's an open invitation to utilities. So that's it. So I will, I guess, Jennifer, Amber, you guys have some questions for us?
Yes, Chris, we received a lot of really great questions coming through the panel here, and unfortunately I don't think we'll be able to address all the questions that have been presented here, but we will have somebody from our team follow up with the questions that have been submitted. So the first question here is, what exactly does it mean to misdial a phone, and what are the implications? And Becky, if you could address that with the audience, that would be great. What exactly does it mean to misdial a phone, and what are the implications?
Sorry, I was talking to myself on mute. If you auto-dial a call, and that call goes to a number that has been, that when you dialed it, you believed it belonged to your customer, and that you had consent, but it's been reassigned, then after your one free call, you have gotten you have a TCPA violation. If you are dialing a number that belongs to a consumer, to one of your consumers, and you have consent, but you dial the number wrong, you transpose two numbers, chances are somewhat low that you've violated TCPA, because under those circumstances, you're almost certainly actually dialing a number as opposed to using an auto dialer, unless you have entered the wrong number, a transposed number, into your CRM records, in which case you've got then you have a no consent to call situation. So you need to tease this apart into a variety of circumstances. But basically, if you're calling a number that a consumer has given you, but that number has been reassigned, and you're using auto dialer equipment, then you have a potential TCPA exposure.
Okay, thank you, Becky. A question came in on the one-call exemption. What are your thoughts on the one-call exemption, and how are companies using that?
Well, I think that most companies that we've spoken to are placing very, very little, or deriving very little comfort from it, because the way it is written, you never know whether or not you have actually undertaken, whether you have actually already used your one free call, because if you call and the user doesn't pick up the phone, or the user answers the phone but doesn't tell you that you're calling a disconnected number or any of those things, you've used it up. So we've spent a lot of time talking with companies about this, and I think most everybody is looking at this as, obviously you need to be prepared to record and act on any information that you get in a call. So, you have to have a system for, if somebody says, this number does not belong to Becky Burr, then you have to have some mechanism of capturing that information and feeding it back into your CRM system and into your call center. But beyond that, I don't think people feel like it is much of a protection.
Okay, Chris, a question came in on how does the analysis presented compare to other industries?
Yeah, so it's similar yet different. I've certainly seen with some, for example, like prime credit card portfolios. You know, we've had those verification rates in that top green section at 90%. It all just depends upon the data that's coming in and specifically the age. And you know, a lot of these credit card portfolios, specifically prime credit portfolios, have very clean phone information. But utilities kind of run the gamut of the credit spectrum, and it's most likely just that heavily aged phone data. I looked at an analysis very recently where somebody had included dates, and these are dates that the accounts were initially originated, and there were dates in there from the early 70s that people have been with these utilities. Now, whether the phone information, you know, has updated since then, probably, but it's just an extreme example of how aged data can be from a utility. So I'd say that's the biggest difference. Is just those, you know, bad, wrong phone numbers in the utilities. They're unaware of it, and it's typically higher than other industries.
Okay, thank you. And I think we have time for one last question. How are companies solutioning this into their existing systems? Chris, if you could respond to that, please.
Yeah, so I assume that's more of a technical question, so I'll answer it that way. So, you know, with utilities, you know, I think one of those last couple of slides I had out there was about the delivery mechanisms and you know, how we're ultimately interfacing with companies. So with utilities, it's much more of this change notification platform where we will host phone numbers on our servers, and then as anything changes, and a lot of this can be very much customized to what constitutes a change, you know, we can send those alerts to a utility so that they're aware of it the moment that it's happening. Other companies and utilities would just send us batch files, so a file of however many names and phone number records, and it's just through an SFTP connection. We're just dropping a file, we're processing it, and then automatically dropping it back on that SFTP so a company can get access to these phone numbers. And then from there, how it's actually integrated back into their system, it depends on the system. But you know, it's pretty straightforward. We've been doing this a while with certainly lots of companies, so can usually work through a lot of those different integration scenarios.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I think that's all the time we have now for questions. Again, we will be responding to the questions that were submitted in the next few days, and we'll go back to CS Week to conclude the webinar.
Thank you, Becky, Chris, Jennifer. That was a very valuable presentation and some really good information you've shared with the attendees. As Jennifer mentioned, we're getting close to the top of the hour, so we do want to be respectful of your time and conclude promptly. We want to invite you to join us again this Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern as we look at how utility marketplace, our animated market transformation in New York and beyond with simple energy. At this time, though, I do want to again thank Becky and Chris and Neustar for today's webinar and for sponsoring this webinar today. And thank the attendees for joining us, and this will conclude the webinar.